Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is July 21st. On this day in 1873, a gang of outlaws brought the wild frontier to the railroads. Under the cover of night in Iowa, Jesse James, Frank James, and members of the Younger family gang carried out what would become one of the first major train robberies in American history. It was a new kind of crime for a rapidly modernizing country, targeting the powerful railroads and shaking public confidence in America's seemingly unstoppable expansion westward. Today, we're traveling back to 1873 to explore the James Younger Gang's first successful train robbery, how it unfolded, who was behind it, and why it left such a lasting mark on the American psyche. Let's get started. In the chaotic years following the Civil War, the South and the Midwest were still reeling. The end of the war left behind economic devastation, political unrest, and thousands of battle-hardened young men who had learned to fight, but now had nowhere to turn. Among these men were Jesse and Frank James, brothers from Missouri who had fought with Confederate guerrilla units like those led by William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson. These were not regular soldiers. They waged brutal, irregular warfare marked by ambushes and massacres. After the war, the James brothers struggled to reintegrate into society. They were embittered by defeat and were distrustful of the federal government, so they decided to turn to crime. The brothers robbed banks and stagecoaches in Missouri, earning a twisted sort of fame. They soon teamed up with the younger brothers, Cole, Jim, John, and Bob, who had also served as Confederate guerrillas. Together, they became the James Younger Gang, one of the most feared outlaw groups of the era. To some, especially in the South, they were folk heroes, rebels still fighting the Union by robbing Northern-backed banks and railroads. But make no mistake, their motivations were rooted in greed, not ideology. And with each heist, they grew bolder. By the early 1870s, the James Younger Gang had already pulled off several daring robberies. But robbing a moving train? That was something new and incredibly risky. Trains were a powerful symbol of post-war progress. They transported goods, money, and mail all across the expanding country. They were heavily guarded and constantly in motion. Robbing one meant stepping into uncharted territory, and it meant taking a major gamble. But with Missouri getting too hot due to increased law enforcement, the gang began looking for opportunities further afield. Iowa, with its vast open plains and sparse policing, became their ideal target. The gang set their sights on the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad, one of the busiest lines in the Midwest. It regularly carried government payrolls and commercial cash shipments between Chicago and Council Bluffs. Reports suggest that the gang may have received a tip about a particularly large shipment expected to pass through Iowa on July 21, 1873. Whether that tip came from a railroad insider or a sympathetic supporter is unknown, but the gang got to work. Cole Younger was the strategist, so he likely led the planning. The gang identified a vulnerable spot near Adair, Iowa, a curve in the tracks where the train would have to slow down. It was also surrounded by farmland and timber that offered good cover. They decided to derail the train. Using crowbars and other tools, they loosened a section of the track and secured it with a rope tied to a nearby fence. The idea was to pull the rail out of alignment just as the train approached. It was a bold plan, and it was nearly flawless in its execution. As darkness fell on July 21st, the gang waited near the curve west of Adair. Around 8:30 p.m., the targeted train approached. It was a passenger and express train operated by the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. Inside the express car was an iron safe rumored to be carrying U.S. Army payroll money and funds from area banks. At just the right moment, the gang pulled the rope, yanking the loosened rail out of place. The train hit the brake at speed, and the engine and express car derailed, crashing into a ditch. Engineer John Rafferty was thrown from the train and killed instantly. His fireman, Edward Wood, was seriously injured but survived. Though dozens of passengers were shaken, miraculously, none were killed. Wearing crude masks made from white flour sacks, the gang stormed the wreck. They subdued the train crew and made for the express car. Though they couldn't open the heavy safe, they made off with $2,000 to $3,000 in cash and silver, which would be about $80,000 in today's money. Within minutes, the gang vanished into the night on horseback, disappearing into the countryside. News of the robbery spread like wildfire. By morning, the scene in Adair was chaotic. The mangled engine lay in a ditch, tracks were twisted and torn, and the express car was a wreck. But what shocked the public most was the death of John Rafferty. His killing, which was caused by deliberate sabotage, turned the robbery into a much bigger crime. Newspapers across the country ran front-page stories about the robbery. The Rock Island Railroad offered a $10,000 reward, and the Pinkerton Detective Agency was hired to track the gang. Detectives quickly honed in on the James and Younger brothers based on eyewitness accounts and past patterns. But catching them was another matter. The gang had a strong support network across Missouri and the Midwest. Many locals still saw them as heroes and were willing to help them evade capture. In the months that followed, security on trains was beefed up. Armed guards were hired, routes were changed, and law enforcement cooperation between states increased. The message was clear: trains were no longer untouchable. The Adair train robbery marked a turning point for both the gang and the country. It showed that even the mighty railroad companies were vulnerable, and it introduced a new type of crime that would plague the American West for decades. Other gangs took notice. Train robbery became a hallmark of the Wild West, with infamous outlaws like Butch Cassidy and the Dalton Gang following the James Younger blueprint. The gang itself would remain active for several more years, pulling off robberies across multiple states. But their luck began to run out. In 1876, a failed bank robbery in Northfield, Minnesota, resulted in a deadly shootout. Several gang members were killed, and the Younger brothers were captured. Jesse and Frank escaped, but would never operate with the same freedom. Jesse James was killed in 1882 by Robert Ford, a member of his own gang. Frank James surrendered soon after. Today, the Adair robbery is remembered not just as a daring heist, but as a key moment in the mythologizing of the American outlaw. The rail line was eventually repaired, and a plaque now marks the spot where history was made. More than 150 years later, the legend of the James Younger Gang still echoes across the plains of the Midwest. Their crimes changed how America viewed law, order, and the very idea of justice. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this episode compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!